everyone, and welcome to lesson 11.3. Today you're going to want to have handy the notes handout if you have the ability to print them out that I attached to this Edpuzzle link, or you're going to want a notebook to take notes in because we are not using the Springboard book. You're also going to need a pencil, and you might also want the 11.2 notes handout that I had from yesterday to reference. So I'd like to begin today with a little bell ringer. So remember each of these pieces we talked about in the last lesson, hence why I said the 11.2 notes handout might be handy. Remember with the vertical angles theorem, that's where we're going to see the opposite angles congruent. So those angles would be congruent, or we could say these two angles are congruent because they are vertical, okay? The reflexive property we talked about yesterday, an example of that would be this here, where we know that this piece here is congruent to itself, right? For instance, if we called it segment AB, AB would be congruent to AB because something is always congruent to itself. Now, some other terms we haven't talked about in a while is the idea of a midpoint. A reminder, when you have a midpoint, that is a point that divides a segment into two congruent pieces. So number 3, we would have this example here. And then finally, a bisector could be considered both of an angle and a segment. A bisector of an angle is a ray. And what the bisector does is it cuts it into two congruent pieces. Again, we also could have a bisector of a segment. Let's say a line is bisecting that segment. We would mark our pictures accordingly. Okay, so there's some review of some terminology we've talked about in the past. Well, today, if we look at the notes handout or you look at your notebook, we're going to start writing proofs with this. Now, it's been a while since we've written proofs, so we're definitely going to have to kind of review looking at the 2-column proof. But here's a picture, right? And they are giving us two pieces of information. One, that X is the midpoint of JK, and that JL is congruent to KL. When we write these 2-column proofs, it's really important that we start, just like we did with algebraic proofs, by writing down our given information. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to write down our first given, which is X is the midpoint of segment JK. And I know that that was given to me. I'm going to check it off that I wrote it down. Now, just like we did in the bell ringer example, we know if something is a midpoint, it divides the segment into two congruent segments. So now that I wrote that on the picture, I need to make sure I state that in my proof, that JX is congruent to XK because the definition of a midpoint means that we divided that segment into two congruent pieces. So definition of midpoint. Now, we also want to make sure we use our other piece of given information, and that was that JL is congruent to KL, right? And that's stated right here. So I'm going to mark that in my picture. Segment JL is congruent to segment KL. And again, I'm able to say that because it was given to me. Again, I'm going to check it off now that I used it, so I know I've written down all my givens. Now, we need a third piece of information in order to prove that these two triangles are congruent. And we've stated both the givens and used them up. So the last thing we're going to do is we're going to look if there's anything we can assume from this picture. Well, very similar to the example we drew in the bell ringer, we know that LX is congruent to itself because of the reflexive property. So we would say that LK, LX is congruent to LX by the reflexive property. And again, that's what we're seeing up here. Reflexive property is why LX is congruent to itself. Well, now I have 3 pairs of sides congruent. side, side, side pair tells me that I can say finally that these two triangles are congruent to each other by side, side, side. So that would be our reasoning for step 5. And we've done our proof statement, so we are done with this proof. Now, could we also eventually state then that angle J is congruent to angle K now that we've stated these triangles are congruent? And the answer to that would be yes, because we know the corresponding angles of congruent triangles are congruent, right? Once we know the triangles are congruent, we know all the remaining sides and angles also have to be congruent to each other. We again call this CPCTC. Okay, so that's something we're definitely going to use a lot as well. CPCTC. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. All right, let's try one more example. And then this time it is that we are being given that we have a perpendicular bisector to JK, and we are given two segments together. So let's start by writing down that first piece of information, right? LX is the perpendicular bisector to JK. And we know that this is given to us, okay? Now from here, we know a couple things based on this. But basically what we know is that if these are perpendicular, we have two right angles. So we know that angle LXJ is a right angle, and we know that angle LXK are right angles. Okay? So because of this information, we know this is going to be true because of the definition of perpendicular. Now the next thing we know here is that all right angles are congruent. So we could say angle LXJ is congruent to angle LXK because all right angles are congruent. Okay. Now, from here, we also need to write down our other piece of given information, which is that the segments JX and KX are congruent to each other. So that's step 4. JX is congruent to KX because it was given. And finally, we can assume from the picture that LX is congruent to LX by the reflexive property. And now that we have a pair of angles congruent, a pair of sides congruent, and another pair of sides congruent, we can finally state that these two triangles are congruent because of side, angle in the middle, side. So SAS would be the reason these triangles are congruent, and we would say triangle JXL is congruent to triangle KXL, making sure those corresponding angles line up. Now, last but not least, a reminder, you need 3 things congruent in order to state that triangles are congruent. So notice here, if we know that LX bisects our angle, that's one piece of information. We can also state the reflexive angle, but notice in this given information, this last one, they did not give us enough information. So, going back to what we talked about in the last lesson, if you don't have 3 things congruent, you can't do the proof. So this one is not going to end up being possible because we only have a pair of angles and a pair of sides. That's not enough information. Okay? We will definitely work more with proofs in class and in the next lesson. Thanks everyone, and see you in class.